Hi everyone, my name is Moses, and today I'm excited to present some of our recent work investigating the question, can your neurons hear the shape of an object? So I want to begin with an observation. The propagation of waves of neural activity is something that's been measured on the surface of the brain from some of the earliest neural recordings that we have. These waves have been observed to travel both locally and globally within and across cortical regions. And in particular, stimulus-evoked waves have been measured in the visual cortex, including in awake behaving primates, which is what I'm showing up here. If you look at the image at the bottom right quadrant is where this wave first really starts to emerge, and then it crosses over the entire image. So that's an example of what I mean when I say wave traveling across an image. And over time, numerous hypotheses have been put forth to explain the functional role of these waves. So some are that these waves are relevant to predictive coding or the representation of symmetries. Others argue that they are important to the consolidation of long-term memories or the encoding of motion. In particular, there's one hypothesis we'll be studying today, and it is that waves serve as this mechanism for the transfer and integration of information over long distances. So for example, if someone is paying attention to this visual scene, and in particular looking at the purple box, right, it's unclear just looking at this box whether this region is part of the sky or the lake, because it could be a reflection of the sky. So to better understand this, that person has to then integrate information from the red box, which is very obviously a rock in the lake, and the blue box, which is part of the sky, and then use their understanding of distances, combine this information together to be able to understand, okay, this purple box is actually the lake, it's just a reflection of the sky. So that's one example of what I mean when I say spatial integration of information or global integration of information. However, it has been pretty challenging to investigate this hypothesis computationally since we don't have a lot of neural network models in particular to generate wave dynamics, right? So what we want to do in this approach to better understand the causal role of wave dynamics is fill this modeling gap. And this figure shows the overall modeling approach that we developed. The idea is that our model is essentially a lattice of neurons, right? So these neurons have some state that will evolve over time. These neurons will take in some, or be exposed to some visual stimulus that will set their response properties as well as their initial condition or their initial state. This state will evolve over time under these recurrent wave dynamics. And at the end, the resulting time series at each neuron or at each spatial location will be a globally integrated representation of the entire visual stimulus. So you could do different tasks using these representations. In our case, we'll be looking specifically at semantic segmentation. So I want to provide a motivating example for this work and for how waves might actually do this sort of spatial integration. And a lot of this work was inspired from this math problem, can one hear the shape of a drum? Informally, this question just asks if you strike a drum or you play this drum, can you tell what the shape of the drum is just based on the sound that you hear? A bit more formally, we're referring to a drum as some elastic membrane with a fixed boundary. So in this figure, the boundary is this kind of bent oval shape, but you could imagine any sort of boundary like a triangle or a square or some polygon. And so we can walk through what would happen in this scenario, right? So you strike this drum head and it produces an initial disturbance, or like I mentioned previously, sets this initial condition. And this will propagate outwards as a traveling wave until it reaches the boundary condition or the drum head. Once it hits the drum head, this wave will bounce back in and then collide with other waves that have hit other parts of the boundary and come back in. And these waves will reflect back outwards and then back inwards and over again. So what we're asking when we pose the question, can one hear the shape of a drum, really is, can we infer the shape of this boundary condition just based on these recurrent wave dynamics? And as it turns out, the answer is, generally speaking, yes, you can hear the shape of a drum, because reflecting against this boundary condition collects information. So this reflected wave has information about the boundary condition. So what we want to do is test this idea out empirically. So we built a computational model of square drums using a discretization of the wave equation. And square drums are particularly important here because there's a known mathematical formula that relates frequency of waves on a square drum to the side length. So if you have the frequency, you can calculate what the side length should be, and if you have the side length, you can derive the expected frequency of waves. And square drums are also useful because every side has the same length, so if you know the length of one side, you essentially know the shape of the drum. So intuitively what you expect is a larger drum should have a lower frequency of waves because each wave has to travel farther before it reflects out. And that's exactly what we see in our simulations. So the top row shows our lower frequency drums, and they tend to oscillate a lot more, or excuse me, the top row shows our smaller drums, and they oscillate a lot more frequently than the bottom row drums, which are the larger drums. So what did we do? We simulated a bunch of drums of different sizes and then compared their theoretical frequencies in gray to their measured frequencies in blue, and we see they match up very, very closely. There's some error due to numerical integration issues. But since they match up so closely, we could, if we wanted to, take our measurements and derive side length from that. So in essence, we have found the shape of these drums. So there are two main takeaways we took from this experiment. One, that we can actually build like a computational model of waves, and two, that these waves have some useful shape information. So we wanted to build upon this intuition, and we asked, okay, can we hear the shape of a polygon? So we built a simple data set of polygons where each image has some polygons, and this model is supposed to take in an input image and produce a segmentation mask for that image. And our model here is a network of locally coupled oscillators called the neural wave machine, or NWM. You can think of this again as some sort of lattice of neurons, where each neuron state is going to be dependent or evolve according to this differential equation up here. So I'll provide some high-level intuition for the dynamics. So there's three terms in this equation. The first term is a local connectivity term. All this says is that each neuron's current state is coupled to the state of its nearest neighbors. So over time, the neuron state is only dependent on itself and its nearest neighbors. This is kind of exactly a convolution operation. The next term is natural frequency and damping. These are two additional terms you can think of as some sort of generic features of the input image. Okay. So what do we expect that will happen when we run this model forward and extract a time series? Well, if each shape has a unique wave dynamic, then it stands to reason that these shapes also have unique frequency spectrum. These waves are unique in frequency space. So if we take the Fourier transform over time, these shapes should separate out in frequency space, and that is exactly what we see. So the lower frequency bin, frequency 20 here, tends to correspond to the background, whereas the hexagon and triangle segment out into the higher frequency bins. In addition, we measured dataset-wide Fourier bins for each class, and you can see that each shape has a very unique frequency spectrum, and that allows the model, if you feed this frequency spectrum to like a MLP classifier, to solve this task with greater than 99% accuracy. The cool thing we were able to do is actually synthesize the Fourier spectra together and then produce some sounds, so you can kind of actually listen to the sounds the model learned for each shape. So here is the triangle. Here's the square, and here's the hexagon. Okay, so we ran with this and scaled our experiments up a little bit more, and now we worked on a tetrominoes data set. Again, for everything we're showing here, it is a semantic segmentation task. These images are just slightly more complicated. And we wanted to compare the NWM, which is this wave bias model, against a convolutional LSTM, because that model doesn't have any inherent inductive bias to produce waves. But what we found is by training this model to solve this segmentation task, the LSTM also learned to produce waves to solve the task, which could hint at some optimality of a wave-based solution. In addition, in these experiments, we moved away from the Fourier transform and instead took a learned linear projection of the time series. And even though we did this projection, we still find that shapes separate out into this projection bin instead. And here you can see some of the waves the LSTM learned to solve the task, even though, again, it has no inductive bias to do so. Okay, so you can also view a lot of this work that we did as fitting under the broader literature comparing recurrence and depth. So in this experiment, we scaled up to an MNIST data set. So this is not classification, it's still segmentation. But we want to produce, we want to assign the label at each spatial location to the correct digit, right? So we compared against CNNs of varying depth from 2 to 32 layers. And intuitively, what you expect would happen is as depth increases, the effective receptive field of the CNN representation should grow until, if you have like a 32-layer CNN, the representation should be global, right? Nearly global, so performance should be quite high. And generally speaking, that's what we found empirically as well, where increasing depth increased performance. But we saw a lot more instability with these larger CNNs. A lot more runs tend to crash early and never really recover, which is why the average performance of the 32-layer CNN, it dropped significantly, even though the peak performance for some runs was still quite high. We also compared different time series readouts for the NWM, which is in orange. So I talked about the Fourier transform before, which is the FFT, or the linear projection that we learned. We also looked at taking just the last time point of the hidden state, and this actually performed the worst, even though this is something that's very commonly done when working with recurrent models. And it's not super surprising that the linear transform works super well because it's a very flexible transformation of the entire time series. The last set of experiments we ran was on a multi-MNIST dataset. This is again segmentation, but this dataset has 1 through 4 digits per image, and we're supposed to output a parental label at each pixel for what digit that pixel belongs to. And in these experiments, we wanted to compare against UNets, which are widely used in diffusion models and are especially important for this comparison because they have global receptive fields through the use of skip connections and bottleneck layers, while our wave-based model doesn't have any of this global receptive field. The only global information anything in our model receives is through these traveling waves. And we found that the wave-based model actually outperformed UNets of comparable size. So in summary, by training these locally constrained RNNs to solve tasks that require the integration of global information, specifically semantic segmentation, we found that neurons are able to learn to encode information and transfer it over long distances through the use of these traveling waves. And if you're curious, I encourage you to check out the manuscript, or we have a blog post as well. But I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Yes, it's very interesting work. And I'm just wonder about your biological interpretation. So basically you're saying that traveling waves help information to travel across the cortex, even if there is no long distance connections, right?
Yes.
So basically, what's the cause and effect? Like when we measure waves, it's a result of activations, or activations are results of waves, a kind of mean field situation.
Yeah, I think waves are a result of these activations. There's a lot of like local connections by which they propagate, is how I interpret it.
So basically, we just observe neuron activations through this electrical fields.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Great talk.
Thank you.
So the kind of topology that you talked about was 2D lattice. Is there any reason to consider other more interesting or complex topologies?
So I mentioned a 2D lattice, but this is actually like more of a 3D one. The 2D lattice was easy to explain how these neurons work, but each of them kind of is 3D in that they have some vector representation.